Hi, I'm Maria Thea Harris with Velo Sews on social media. Welcome back to Sew Organised Style podcast for Sew Over 50. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to hit subscribe, leave a 5-star rating and write a review. You can find Sew Organised Style podcast but with an S, not a Z, on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts.
And then the bushfires of 2019-2020, I mean, that really just about pushed me over the edge. I also made a piece about that, which I'm not sure if you saw or not, but a very long embroidered piece about the fires, my reaction to the fires.
That's Tracey Clement. You'll find her sewing on Instagram as Tracy_Tinker_Taylor. Now, Tracey's art projects are at Tracey A. Clement. On another topic, if you live in Australia and decide to purchase your own Mimiquin, I'll be your body scanner. Go to mimiquin.com to book your scanning session. Now let's grab a cuppa to hear Tracey's story.
Can you hear me?
Of course.
Well, you never know.
Thank you so much for coming on to the podcast today. We don't know each other, but I've been following you on Instagram for quite a while.
Thank you. Yeah, Instagram's terrific for this stuff, isn't it?
Yeah, and look, I usually go on there to see what people are sewing. And when I was watching you prepare your latest works, I thought, what is she doing? Because it was wide on clear, and I hadn't realized the depth of your artwork and your history.
I mean, they're interrelated, aren't they? But I did separate my two Instagram accounts a while ago. So I have one which is more my professional artist academic account, and then I have other one which is mostly sewing for fun, but there's a little bit of crossover.
When you started being a creator, or did you start to learn how to sew when you were at school, or did you learn later in life?
I learned, like a lot of people, from my mother, quite young. Yep. She taught me how to embroider and how to use a sewing machine somewhere around about the age of 7 or 8, like really quite young. And I've always been crafty, I guess, and like to do things with my hands, even as a child. You're constantly being asked what your hobbies were, and I would always say drawing and reading. I was a real geek, I guess, in that sense. But sewing was always part of that as well. So I never really stopped. But yeah, there were some gaps where I wasn't doing as much sewing, especially not garment sewing.
I know that a lot of people, they'll start during their younger life. Then once they leave high school, there's usually starting their careers or their families or both. And so sewing gets sort of put on the side, and then they usually come back to it later on.
Yeah, I never stopped completely, but, I was trying to remember, like, where was I getting a sewing machine? I feel like I didn't own a sewing machine for a large part of my 20s, but, you were just flatting and there'd be one in the house, or, I was using other people's sewing machines, I think. Like, I'm not sure whose they were, but I never stopped completely. But it was in about 2020, just before the pandemic hit. So in January, before we even knew there was going to be a pandemic, I suddenly got sick of trying to buy clothes that just don't fit. They just don't fit. At that point, I was already, a middle-aged lady, and your body had changed. And I don't think I'm that funny of a size, but it was impossible to get anything to fit. It was just driving me absolutely bonkers. So I thought, I'm going to start sewing again. And I did. And, thank goodness for that, because it's pretty much what kept me sane through the entire pandemic period. And is still keeping me sane today. When work is really stressful, sewing, not artwork sewing, because artwork sewing is quite stressful, but sewing for pleasure or sewing garments, I find is just how I can clear my mind of everything else.
Now that you are sort of going back to sewing for yourself because you can't find anything in the shops that actually do the trick for you, are there any particular pattern designers that you lend yourself towards, or how do you choose?
I am drawn to vintage patterns, and I notice on Instagram a lot of people use those sort of named patterns and, current independent pattern designers. But again, I think it comes back to what you did in your childhood. And for some reason, my mother loved simplicity patterns. We only ever really had simplicity patterns. And I've got like two simplicity patterns from like 1962 or something that I just keep modifying until they start fitting properly. So yeah, that's usually my starting point. I'm not sure why, but I've been completely resisting getting my own basic block together and just pattern drafting entirely from scratch. I do know how to do it, but there's something about having to measure yourself, which is just really putting me off. So I tend to approach it. One of the hashtags I use a lot is wearable toile, and I
Yeah.
make something and I make it fit, and then I learn from that, and then I'll just, it's a process of refinement over time. Yeah, I don't try new patterns very often because then I got to start that process all over again.
I definitely identify with when you're starting a new pattern, you have to measure yourself again, and that can be very confronting.
Oh, yeah. And it's quite hard to do by yourself. And, who wants to stand around in their underwear and get someone else to do it for you? So, yeah, I tend to just use myself as the dummy and figure it out. But it does take a good 7 iterations of the same thing to get it as good as it can get. And by that time, you've put on weight or your boobs have dropped some more. I mean, it's an ongoing process, isn't it?
Yeah, I know. Gravity has got a lot to do with how our bodies change. It's just like, really? Again?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
know.
These days, how do you describe yourself? Because you've done quite a lot of things in your life.
Yeah, and I'm still doing quite a lot of things. I mean, generally, I describe myself as a post-menopausal middle-aged woman. I'm an artist. I'm an academic. I am still writing as well. I've got many hats.
I noticed that when I had a look at your
Mm.
Instagram accounts and then I had a look for your website, and you're still doing a lot of writing. And this year you had the show that you put out there that I was watching you create from, was it organza that you were working on?
No, it's tulle, like for a
Chill.
wedding veil. Yeah, that's been a really interesting experience, actually, because that's revisiting old work. So they're figures, which is where I learned pattern making. I taught myself pattern making when I was studying for my master's degree, and I made these figures. I call them my ladies. And that was back in like 2005. I made them based on my shape at the time. And they're made out of white tulle. So they're very transparent. And at that point, I don't know if you remember, but that was, the early 2000s and that kind of extreme makeover where people were getting plastic surgery on
Yeah.
reality TV. And at that point, I think I was about to turn 40. And, when you're about to turn 40, you feel really ancient and a lot of pressure as a woman. And I was feeling a lot of pressure. You're just about to be old and, you really ought to get a nip and a tuck and all this. So at that point, the work was kind of about this unreasonable quest for the perfect body and how we were treating the body almost like a garment that could just be, adjusted at will. And then 20 odd years later, I've revisited those same figures and I started embroidering on them, now that I was 20 years older, all my aching joints. So I did this kind of almost like darning around my knees and my hips and my elbows, everything that was aching. And I entered those in the Dobell Prize for drawing and was accepted. So that was really, really exciting.
Yeah.
And that will tour. I haven't been able to find the dates for you, but that will be touring sometime this year in various regional galleries. So that will be fun. And then after that, I revisited a few of the other ladies, and I started embroidering on them these sort of huge tattoos. And it's really trying to sort of reclaim aging female power. I mean, there's that whole cliche that middle-aged women are invisible. And I like to joke, bring it on. I'd love to be invisible. It sounds like a superpower, it'd be terrific. It's seen as almost entirely negative, and I
Mm.
was trying to sort of, I put these huge like back tattoos on these women that say tough old bird, because it's hard work. It's hard work being an old lady. And, we should embrace the power of it.
There is that stigma that we're invisible, but we're actually quite visible. And I think
Yeah, I
the
don't
good,
feel invisible.
not at all. And like you're still working full time
Yeah,
on various
yeah.
projects.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, but I mean, there's definite aches and pains. Like, absolutely. I'm not going to deny that. And I can't say as I'm loving getting older, but what can you do? I mean, it happens to all of us.
Yeah,
It's
it
nothing to be
does.
ashamed about. Like, we've been kind of brought up to feel like it's something to be ashamed of. And I'm like, this is just life.
Yeah, it is. And it's not when you're actually there that you realize, this is what happens. Now what do I do next? Yeah,
Yeah. Well, yeah, what you do is you start sewing your own clothes so something will fit.
exactly. So in your
Yeah.
early days, you were an art writer.
Yeah, I made my living as a freelance arts writer for quite a long time. I sort of started around about the same time I first made those ladies, actually, like 2004, 2005. Well, I started a little bit earlier than that, but I got a job writing for the Sydney Morning Herald then. So I had a weekly column for a while in a
Mm.
part of the paper that's now defunct, called the Metro. So yeah, I saw an awful lot of art. So that was fun.
So where you are now with your sewing and with your art, do you think that there was a progression from what you were doing professionally to what you're doing now outside of your profession?
The sewing I do to keep myself sane is very different from my art world sewing
Mm.
because the whole point of it is that it doesn't matter if you fail. Like nobody cares if the dress I make doesn't fit or the fabric runs or you're not being the art world is quite critical. And so anytime you put something out there, you feel a little nervous and a little bit anxious about it. And it's not the same at all. So I do think they're quite separate in that sense. I don't care what anyone thinks about the sewing I do just for me. Like I seriously don't care. And that's part of the pleasure of it. It's like it keeps me sane because it fully engages my brain. It's constant problem solving.
Hmm.
When I'm doing that, I'm not thinking about work. I'm not thinking about the state of the universe. I'm just thinking about how do I get this to work? And that just fully turns off all that other stress. And that's wonderful. But at the end of the day, if it's a big disaster, I'm like, oh, well, I'll just learn, and there's no deadlines. Like it's completely different to me. Where there is a little bit of crossover, I suppose, is I've started in my academic career doing some research on craftivism and temperature quilts in particular. And I've made some temperature quilts. And I am really thinking quite intellectually about what role they play in culture and how they may influence people's thinking or what people are thinking when they're doing this stuff. But at this point, it hasn't got to the point where it's stressing me out. So it's still quite good fun as well.
Well, what started you going down this path with the quilting, your academic perspective now? What started that?
I think, like almost everybody, I was introduced to temperature quilts via Instagram. It's pretty much an Instagram driven phenomenon from the research I've done. I immediately kind of took notice of that because I was already very distressed about the climate. The weather's getting insane, and I'd been concerned for a while about just watching the climate change. And I found this phenomenon really interesting. So I made a temperature quilt and found that kind of data visualization really crystallized in my own mind. I mean, what's driven the academic research into that is that I got a full-time teaching research position. So late in life, and I need to conduct research. And I thought, well, I should conduct research, with this community that is generally a little bit marginalized. People don't take quilting ladies all that seriously, and they're not all women, but almost all women. But I conducted a survey online, and I got something like almost 170 responses about making a temperature quilt, and they were all women, actually. I didn't get a single male respondent. And I haven't yet managed to formalize that into a journal article, which is what they want you to do in academia, but it's coming. But yeah, so that formal academic stuff is really the product of having got a job that kind of requires that. And then the bushfires of 2019, 2020, I mean, that really just about pushed me over the edge. I also made a piece about that, which I'm not sure if you saw or not, but a very long embroidered piece about the fires, my reaction to the fires. Um, that took me a really long time to make, but it took me a really long time to process how to deal with the fear, I guess, primarily. I found that really, really confronting, those fires.
Mm.
There's
And
a
there,
very long tradition of processing difficult times through sewing, and it's an effective way of doing that, I think.
during those fires in 2019, 2020, were you actually in a country area at the time?
Actually, part of the time I was away, I was actually in Paris, and I went to visit the Bayeux Tapestry, which was extraordinary. And then I was back in Sydney, and I think part of that is what it was so terrifying is that I wasn't being immediately physically threatened by the fires, yet you could tell
Mm.
that it could just happen. January 2025, when Los Angeles just burned, you're like, right, well, I wasn't just being weird and paranoid. A major metropolis can actually just burn.
Mm.
It's kind of that realization that nobody's safe anymore,
Mm.
and then it could happen anywhere. I wrote a long, very long journal article about this embroidery, which I did get published, in that very academic way. But what it really talks about is that what we've lost is that sense of, it won't happen to me or it won't happen here.
When I was looking at some of the artwork that you did, so there was the recent one that's going around at the moment. There's the fire one that you've just described, which was the long piece that
Yeah.
reflected. Yeah. And then there was a tapestry. Was that a tapestry that you did, or some embroidered cars and
Oh. Oh, yeah, that's the piece I did when I was in Paris.
there you
Yeah.
go.
Oh, thanks for noticing that. Yeah. Yeah, I had just been to see the Bayeux Tapestry, which
Yeah.
I'm sure I'm saying it wrong. Which, everybody who embroiders, it's like the holy grail of embroidery, isn't it? Because it's not a tapestry, it's an embroidery. Yeah, I was in Paris and it was the anniversary. So this was 2019, late 2019, and it was the anniversary of those yellow vest protests. The French love to protest, like they really love it. It was extraordinary to witness this. And I had a residency at the Cité in Paris, which is just kind of opposite the river from Notre Dame. And I could just hear all these sirens. And I looked out the window and it was just extraordinary. There were emergency vehicles, but they were going one way and then the other way. I'm like, where are they going? It was just, so that's what I embroidered on this, embroidery, just these emergency vehicles going, so, both ways. I couldn't figure out what was going on. I'm like, if all these people need to go that way and all these, why aren't they just, it was just extraordinary though.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was my way of processing that. And then it took me a good solid 2 years after that to figure out what to do about the fires. And even though the fire piece is virtually abstract, like it's just squares, there's a really direct relationship in my process between those two pieces.
So can I ask, when you put together something that becomes an art piece and is on show, do you also have to produce the written part of how you got there?
Yeah, it depends on where you're showing it. Everyone's got a different idea about what they want, but most times you do have to come up with a short statement, usually very short, like, 100, 200 words.
Okay.
But I did write this very long journal article, 7,000 odd words on that long embroidery piece about the fires as well. I mean, because I have been a writer for a long time, for me, it's a really good way of clarifying your own thoughts. Like often, I think when we're sewing or making any form of art, you're not always 100% sure what you're up to. And then it's having to put it into words really helps you to clarify what you were actually thinking or what it's actually doing. So it's an interesting process.
Thanks for explaining that, because I've never asked someone who has an art background like yourself what goes into putting together a piece that then gets accepted. And the current one is now touring around all the regional art exhibits. So, I mean, congratulations for that.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I'm excited. I mean, all you really want is for people to see your work. Even your garments, like, I say I don't care what people think, but I love Instagram, all those little hearts. You're just like, oh, people love me. Isn't that great?
What I've found with Instagram and sewing is it has connected a lot of people at times when we've been isolated at home. But even now that we're all able to get out and about, we can connect in real life as well as online.
Absolutely. And the sewing community that I've experienced, the sew over 50 people especially, and people like yourself, the generosity is just extraordinary, and it's such a nice, supportive place where you hear a lot of chatter about social media being really toxic. But that's my experience has been the absolute opposite. I think that everyone has just been so generous and lovely. It's nice to know that there's a corner of the internet where it's nice people.
Yeah, where we exist. Yeah. And I know that the work that Sandy and Judith started, we're looking at about 8 years now that they've been doing this. I mean, they were doing it on their own. And
Yeah, amazing.
now they've got a team.
And it must be such a lot of work, isn't it? I mean, it is a lot of work.
Yeah.
I know from, one of my roles in my job is curating exhibitions and all that admin. It's such a huge amount of work. I really appreciate the work you guys do.
Oh, thank you. The team, Sandy and Judith, would just appreciate, your support as well. So thank you as well. And we've always had to navigate our way through Instagram and all the changes that turn up at a moment's notice, and you sit there going, okay, now what do we do? And we work it out. Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's been great. Really good.
Okay.
Well, thanks for all your hard work.
It's all right. My pleasure.
Thanks for finding me. It's exciting.
For me, it was more that I kept seeing your work pop up and I thought, what is Tracey doing? And what does it mean? And when you finally were showing us the exhibit, I just got so excited for you. I thought, how do I tell her? And I thought, oh, just a like will do, I suppose. Tracey, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast and for being so generous with your time also with Sew Over 50. And, I'm looking forward to seeing the old birds this year.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks, Tracey. This episode of Sew Organised Style Podcast for Sew Over 50 was both video and audio produced by me, Maria Theoharis, in my sewing room. Sound by Knife on YouTube with permission of Tracey Clement. Many thanks for the ongoing monthly support of the podcast Patreon contributors. Their paid Patreon membership enables me to create these video and audio podcasts for you for free. And again, thanks for listening, and don't forget to hit subscribe, leave a 5-star rating and write a review. You can find Sew Organised Style Podcast, but with an S, on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. And yes, if you live in Australia and decide to purchase your own Mimiquin custom dress form, I'll be your body scanner for Mimiquin UK. Contact Mimiquin UK directly. Make sure you go back and listen to our free Sew Over 50 episodes on Sew Organised Style. I look forward to joining you in your sewing room next time. Stay safe, everyone.
If you like the show, please take a moment to rate, review, and subscribe. It really does help the show to grow. Thank you for listening.